So something that I like to do, right? And I believe it's really, really helpful for, and healthy actually for self-development is to self-reflect. Does anyone else like to self-reflect? I like to analyze why it is that I do what I do. You know, why is it that I think a certain way? Why do I react in a certain way? I like to analyze who I am. I like to understand the person that I've become. I'm a sucker for personality tests. Anyone else out there with me? I think understanding the person you are is really helpful in identifying opportunities for growth in your life. And of course, the more you self-reflect, unfortunately, the more you find these opportunities for growth. Am I right? And you start to notice certain behaviors, or at least I do. I start to notice certain patterns that often play out in my life. And one of these patterns that I've noticed that plays out in my own life is my approach to fitness. I've realized that I tend to go through phases. Why don't you comment phases in the chat right now? Because, you know, you don't need to be into fitness to understand phases, right? So I've noticed that I go through this pattern. I have a pattern in my approach to keeping fit. And it starts like this. It'll start with motivation to be physically fit. Maybe I'll be inspired by someone or just disgusted by myself. I'll be inspired. I'll have motivation to be physically fit, which leads to the action of starting some kind of fitness program. For me, that's normally some kind of running routine, right? And I'll set goals of how fast I want to be able to run, you know, my pace per kilometer. I'll set a goal of how far I hope to be able to sustain that pace, right? And I'll set a goal of when I want to be able to achieve that by. And so begins the process. So begins this pattern in my life. And I'll be recording my runs on my watches, and I'll be checking my progress, measuring my progress towards my goals. And I'll start to feel good about myself. And then a setback hits. In the rare occasion, I'll injure myself by going too hard. But more likely, it'll be something general in life. Like life gets too busy. You know, I can't find the time to run, or I'm too tired to run, or I'll, you know, get a cold or something and it'll take me out for a few days. Or yes, I'll admit it, the weather gets bad and I just don't feel like it. But whatever the setback is, without fail, what it does is it causes me to lose momentum. I stop running for a while, and I end up losing all that progress that I've made, all that progress I've gained over the last few weeks, and I'm faced with having to start all over again. The dictionary defines a setback as a reversal or a check in progress. Has anyone ever experienced a setback? Have you ever had to start again? You know, whether you're into fitness or not, we can all relate to the frustration of losing momentum, right? Seeing all of our hard work count for nothing. You know, none of us love losing the progress we've made. And when it came to my running routine, every time I stopped, it'd be so much harder to start back up again. Because setbacks so often kill our motivation. And you know, we've been in this series in church. We've just started over the last couple of weeks, this series called The Rebuild. And I think that's such a great series for the moment we're in, such a great tagline, such a great theme, you know, as we focus on the opportunities that will arise over the next few months as we rebuild, as we navigate out of the lockdown we're in, out of this pandemic, as we start to rebuild our lives and rebuild our church and rebuild our society. And whilst rebuilding presents us with opportunities to start fresh, to innovate, to build back better and stronger, there's no denying that if you have to rebuild, it implies a setback, a reversal or check in progress. Rebuilding implies that we've lost something, that we've lost progress or we've lost momentum. You know, that which we once built has been damaged or destroyed, and now we have to build it back. I think the process of rebuilding can be so much harder than the original build because of this. Have you ever built a sandcastle? Do you remember the hours spent on the beach planning moats and forts, constructing turrets and towers out of sand? So much time and effort goes into building this sandcastle. You spend all day, and then the tide comes, and the sea starts to wash away all your hard work, and you're faced with two choices: to start again or to abandon it to the sea. I believe a rebuild presents us with a similar dilemma. Do we allow the setbacks we're facing to erase what we've built? or do we find the motivation to rebuild? But finding that motivation is much easier said than done, right? The thought of rebuilding is daunting, and is fraught with reluctance. A reluctance to invest that same time, that energy, all those resources all over again. We see all of our previous efforts as wasted. Building what you've already built is frustrating. And just like building a sandcastle, it seems way less exciting the second time around. And I think that thought can put us off rebuilding entirely. It can cause us to decide to turn our attention elsewhere. Maybe our time, our energy, our resources would be better spent investing in something else, building something else. And for many of us, this is where we stand in our lives right now. We're faced with two choices: to rebuild or abandon it to the sea. But unlike sandcastles on a beach, right, the rebuilds that many of us are facing could have significant impact in our own lives, but maybe even the lives of other people around us. Some of us are faced with rebuilding relationships, building back those bridges of trust that have been broken. Some of us have lost our jobs during this pandemic, and now there are people faced with rebuilding their careers from the bottom up. Some people are hoping to rebuild connections that they've lost during social isolation. Some of us are faced with rebuilding our finances, maybe rebuilding businesses or streams of income. And as a church, we're faced with rebuilding as we head into this new season of church online and also in-person services. We're faced with rebuilding our systems and structures, reinforcing our culture and vision, maybe looking at rebuilding our impact in our cities. And friends, as we navigate the end of this pandemic, how do we approach rebuilding our broken society? This last year has been fraught with social discord. How do we even approach rebuilding a better, more inclusive, more loving society? See, the rebuilds that we're facing have significant ramifications. And the question is, how do you generate the motivation to rebuild? How do we spark that enthusiasm to go again? How do we muster the energy? How do we put what we've lost behind us? How do we generate motivation for a rebuild? Encouraging enthusiasm in ourselves and in others. How do we do it? I think this is such a difficult question to answer because the context of every rebuild is different. And, although many of us have experienced similar setbacks this year during the pandemic, I know everyone's situation is unique. And maybe you're even watching today or listening today and you're thinking, Sam, listen, there is no coming back from what I've been through. There is no rebuilding the destruction and damage that I've experienced. It's irreparable. But what if there was a way? What if there were some principles that maybe we could apply into our lives, into all of our different contexts, that would help us to build back stronger? Regardless of our setbacks, what they were or what they are. What if we could find a way to generate motivation for the rebuild? In fact, what if our rebuild could yield more success than what we originally built in the first place? And there's a group of people in the Bible, written about in the Bible, that I think we could learn from. And the reason being is because their approach to a setback sees them succeed beyond what you would think possible. Now, if you're watching or listening right now and you wouldn't call yourself a Christian or necessarily believe what I believe, that's okay. You're so welcome here. And in fact, I would encourage you to keep listening with an open mind, because I believe the principles we're about to talk about today can help anyone in any situation if you apply them into your life. So I want to encourage you to keep listening. But this group of people that I was just mentioning were the early church, and they're documented in the book of Acts. And to give you some context, the early church, the early believers, they'd been subject to some persecution, and it was getting pretty bad. There's this guy, Stephen, one of the leaders of the church. He's just been stoned to death in Jerusalem for his faith. So things are getting pretty tense for the church in Jerusalem. So we'll pick up in chapter 11, verse 19 after these events. And I'll read this. It says, because of the persecution triggered by Stephen's death in Jerusalem, many of the believers were scattered. Some reached as far as the coast of Lebanon, the island of Cyprus, and Antioch of Syria. This is a church in crisis. The early church had come under attack. They were being displaced from their homes. The church was being displaced from its venue. Forced into the unknown, they faced a rebuild. And I can imagine the despair as they were forced out of the way they knew how to do things, the way that they were used to. The church so far had been built so far was now under attack. And their way of doing things was under attack. And one wouldn't blame them for losing motivation or enthusiasm for building the church, right? I mean, I wouldn't. But after all, they were under the threat of death. One of their leaders had just been publicly executed as an example. This was a pretty big setback. But what follows in this passage doesn't describe a church in crisis. It doesn't depict a people burdened by loss. Let's continue. Let's read. So the church has been scattered across Lebanon, Cyprus, Antioch of Syria. I'll continue reading. But they were still only preaching the word to Jews. Verse 20, however, some of the believers from Cyprus and Cyrene who had come to Antioch in Syria preached to the non-Jews living there, proclaiming the message of salvation in the Lord Jesus. And the mighty power of the Lord was with them as they ministered, and a large number of people believed and turned their hearts to the Lord. What's fascinating to me here is that the early believers were not put off by the setback they faced. The unwelcome change in circumstances didn't seem to change anything for them, as a matter of fact, other than their location. And I believe one of the reasons they were able to continue their mission, to continue carrying out their calling despite the obstacles they faced, is that they had an attitude of innovation. They not only accepted change, they embraced it. They were willing to adapt their method in order to continue carrying out, delivering their message. You see, an attitude of innovation will help you navigate any situation. Obstacles become opportunities. I know that I've said that before, but it's so true. Setbacks cultivate success. The early church didn't allow their circumstances to stop their mission. Rather than becoming discouraged with the prospect of rebuilding from scratch, the early believers chose to view their situation as an opportunity to continue building the church. For them, it was business as usual. So how did they keep this positive approach to change? Most of us hate change. It's uncomfortable. It's stressful. It takes up time and energy. But despite the death threats and displacement from their homes, their motivation and enthusiasm to rebuild, or to continue building rather, it didn't seem to waver at all. Why? Because their rebuild wasn't limited by their past experiences. They saw the possibilities ahead instead of holding on to the past. They didn't focus on what they had lost or the way that they knew how to do things. They focused on the opportunities of the future. So your focus shapes your future. When it comes to rebuilding or approaching any change in our lives, for that matter, we can get so focused on what was that we fail to see what could be. What would your life look like if you were able to let go of what was and chose to build back stronger, stepping into what could be? Imagine our church in a year's time if we chose to embrace an attitude of innovation. Imagine if the early church had decided that, because we can't do things how we used to do them, there's no point in doing them at all. Imagine if they'd stubbornly stuck to what they had known. The church across the world right now would not be the same. For the early church, spreading out across the Mediterranean was not part of their past experience. Preaching to non-Jews was not part of their past experience. Building a thriving church in Antioch instead of Jerusalem was not part of their past experience of building church. But they didn't let that stop them. They didn't allow persecution to halt their mission because they knew that God could work through every situation. Romans 8:28, for we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. who've been called according to his purpose. See, God didn't cause their persecution, just like he didn't cause the pandemic, but he was able to use the situation to open doors that the early church had not walked through before. See, every obstacle is an opportunity when you are open to what God can do. If they had been focused only on what they had lost, they would have missed the opportunity they gained. So keep an attitude of innovation. It's the first thing. And secondly, don't allow your rebuild to be limited by your past experiences. But that's not all. Remember, we talked about generating motivation, right? Generating enthusiasm for the rebuild. Cue Barnabas. As we read on in this passage in Acts 11, I'm going to read from verse 22. We learn about this guy called Barnabas. News of what was happening in Antioch reached the church of Jerusalem. So the apostles sent Barnabas to Antioch as their emissary. And when he got there and witnessed for himself God's marvelous grace, he was enthused and overjoyed. He encouraged, hold on to that. He encouraged the believers to remain faithful and to cling to the Lord with passionate hearts. So Barnabas was an encourager. He's actually introduced to us earlier in Acts 4. It says that he was a Levite from Cyprus named Joseph, who sold his farmland and placed the proceeds at the feet of the disciples, and they nicknamed him Barnabas, or encourager. See, the name Barnabas means encourager or son of encouragement. And the passage tells us that Barnabas traveled all the way from Jerusalem to encourage. He went out of his way to encourage people to remain faithful and passionate in the Lord. It's not like he could have just jumped on an hour's flight or 2 hours flight, I don't know how far it was, and just popped over to say hi. This guy traveled for days to what? To encourage. He encouraged because it was who he was. He was a son of encouragement. He was an encourager. But you can tell this by the way the passage describes him, right? He was enthused and overjoyed. I love being around people like this. They seem to be able to find the good in everything. They have a knack of being able to lift people's spirits, and their enthusiasm is contagious. And I've always wished that I could be like that. And I've wondered, what their secret is. What is it that they do to be able to do that? And it's quite simple, actually. They encourage others. The act of encouragement is something that the Bible instructs all of us to do. You see, we don't have to be pastors or preachers or leaders with titles to be able to give a word of encouragement. The Bible says that encouragement is for all of us. In 1 Thessalonians 5:11, it says, therefore encourage one another. And get this, build each other up. I think that's so cool in this series that we're in, the Rebuild. Encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you have been doing. And as we encourage each other, as we encourage others, we build each other up. And we gain momentum, we can inspire enthusiasm. As we all navigate the inevitable change that's coming over our way over the next few months, believe me, we are all going to need some encouragement. As we face rebuilds in our personal life, as we face rebuilding the church, the impact of the church, as we face rebuilding society, we are all going to need to be able to encourage and to be encouraged. So my application for you this week is simple. I want you to contact one person and I want you to encourage them. I want you to make it personal. I want you to make sure that they understand how valued they are, how appreciated they are. Encourage them to keep going. Encourage them to have an attitude of innovation, to embrace the possibilities of the rebuild. And right now, what I want you to do is something practical. I want you to write down their names. And whatever you're taking notes, because I'm assuming you're taking notes this morning, write down their name. I want you to do it now in your notes, in your reminder app, in your calendar, whatever it is. Write down their name and then comment done in the chat to make other people feel guilty. No, to encourage people, obviously. To encourage others to do the same. I want you to write their name down so you don't forget. Who can you encourage this week? As I said, unlike Barnabas, we don't have to travel for days to bring a word of encouragement. We can encourage in seconds. We have the possibility of instant encouragement. One call, one Zoom, one text is all it takes. You can leave a spark of motivation in someone's life this week. And you don't know who you might motivate through your encouragement. You don't know what the impact of that motivation, that encouragement might have. You see, if we look at the example of Barnabas, yes, he was a man of encouragement. As you read on in Acts 11, you find out that Barnabas goes to find Paul, or Saul, who's recently become a Christian. And Paul, he then accompanies Paul as Paul starts out his ministry. And Paul becomes one of the greatest apostles of the New Testament. The impact of Paul is undeniable in the church, across the world, in history. But who knows what impact Barnabas, son of encouragement, had on Paul's life, had on Paul's ministry. And who knows what impact your contagious enthusiasm, your word of encouragement, your word of motivation could have in someone's life. As you encourage others, you're going to find encouragement yourself. As you encourage others, you will be encouraged also. As you motivate others, you yourself will find motivation. You know, in Luke 6:38, it says, "Give, and it will be given unto you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be poured into your lap. For the measure you use will be measured to you." Can I encourage you this morning to be sons and daughters of encouragement? Let's encourage people to have that attitude of innovation, to not focus on what they've lost, but look to the possibilities of the future. I need to finish in just a moment, but imagine if we were all able to embrace an attitude of innovation. When it comes to the rebuild, you know, what would our church look like over the next 6 months, the next 12 months, the next 5 years? As obstacles and setbacks inevitably litter our path, how are we going to be able to pivot? How are we going to be able to innovate, adapt, and build back stronger? Imagine if we choose to open ourselves up to the opportunities that change brings. What could we achieve in our own lives, through our church, and in our society? You know, I believe as the world comes out of this pandemic, as they navigate out, it's going to need leaders who know how to navigate a rebuild. Leaders who are not limited by what they've lost, but rather leaders who are focused on the future. Leaders who can build up other leaders. Leaders who can bring others along the journey. Leaders who can inspire enthusiasm. Leaders of encouragement. Can I pray for you really quickly? God, I thank you for every single person who's watching or listening to this message today. God, would you help us to have an attitude of encouragement? God, would you help us to focus on the future and leave behind what we've lost in the past? God, would you help us to become sons and daughters of encouragement? God, would you help us to impact the people in our world? God, would you help us to look to you as our source of encouragement?